This is another episode of Standup Comedy, your host and MC, celebrating 40-plus years on the fringe of show business. Stories, interviews, and comedy sets from the famous and not so famous. Here's your host and MC, Scott Edwards.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. Hey, a while back, I had a really interesting conversation with a stand-up comic from back in Tennessee. He's had a great life as a stand-up comic. You've heard him on Sirius Radio. He's had some Comedy Central moments, a very successful comic, but he's converted that into being a terrific public speaker, things like being mentioned in People magazine. He's done talks for the McDonald's Corporation, General Motors, IBM, even Microsoft. But what's interesting is it all started with him as a journalist. That's right. He was a television reporter for an NBC affiliate in Florida. And I want to talk to him about how comedy and public speaking all kind of branched out from this early seed of being a journalist. So please welcome to the podcast once again for a second time, Greg Schwem. The crowd goes crazy. Greg is back in the house.
The virtual crowd goes nuts again. Thank you, Scott.
Well, we're just excited.
That is a better intro than I've received at so many live shows, including the audience response.
Well, it was such a great interview that we did about a year ago, and I wanted to reach back out to you because I see you marketing on social media. I know you've been very successful as a public speaker, but in a recent conversation that wasn't recorded, you shared that you kind of got your start in television as a television reporter. And what's interesting is being on the fringe of comedy like I was with my chain of comedy clubs, I did my share of radio, many television appearances. And so I'm kind of familiar with those mediums, but maybe you could explain to the audience how you got started in journalism and where it led you.
Yeah. Well, I always wanted to be on television as a reporter. I just always gravitated to wanting to hold a microphone. And I went to Northwestern University and got a journalism degree. It's a great school for journalism. And went down to Florida for my first job. I actually was a print reporter. And then I transitioned into TV news, which I always thought is what I wanted to do. But stand-up comedy since high school had been my quote-unquote side hustle. So, and I never wanted to give that up. It was just a fun thing to do when I moved to Florida, because comedy, as you know, in the mid-'80s was starting to get huge. So I was a TV reporter by day, and then I would put my comedy hat on at night and work. There weren't a lot of clubs, but I was working the clubs in the West Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale area, occasionally driving over to the West Coast and working some of those clubs. And it was just a weekend fun thing to do that eventually I decided I liked doing better, doing more than TV reporting, which is something I thought I would never, ever say.
Well, what's interesting is that you mentioned you always pictured yourself with a microphone in your hand, and you must have that type A personality, kind of like I do, that allows you the talent and the energy and the lack of fear that most people have to get behind a microphone. Now, starting off as a print journalist is kind of interesting because they're really two different beasts.
Totally.
When you're writing, you have to express yourself as succinctly as possible in a minimum amount of words, get a picture across, get the story across. But as a TV reporter, you were mentioning earlier, and I think it's really poignant, and so I want to bring it up in the podcast. There's something about being able to communicate with people and get them to talk about themselves. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. I mean, as a TV reporter, you're walking up to people cold an awful lot, and you're sticking a microphone in their face, and which is intimidating to a lot of people. When you're a print journalist, you're interviewing people on the phone most of the time. Maybe face to face, but a microphone is a whole different beast. And I found that if you could just get people to just relax and ask them the questions that get them talking about things they like to talk about, things that they're familiar with, and use that to get them comfortable. And then you can kind of little by little start asking the questions that you're there for. And it's kind of hard to give a concrete example because sometimes I was covering very, very difficult situations, crimes and, murder and mayhem and things like that. But I found that people would still let their guard down just a little bit if you could make them feel comfortable in saying, hey, we just want to hear from you. You're the story here. I'm not the story. You see me on TV every night, but you're the story, and let's talk about you. And it works.
Well, I think that's a great way to approach it. And I was going to ask if you were doing, hard-hitting news stories or more of the fluff pieces, but it sounds like depending on the situation, it's kind of like comedy where you need to read the room. You can approach the person or approach the situation uniquely based on what's going on. And I think that is an important lesson for anybody that wants to communicate with an audience. It's reading the room and being able to bring out from somebody, whether it's an audience or interviewee on a TV reporting basis, the information you're trying to share.
Yeah. And, I think some comics, when I go on stage as a comedian, my goal is I want to see that everybody's having fun. I think there's some comics that just walk out there and say, I need to get this off my chest. Me type of thing. I don't really care if the audience, digs it or something. And I think, unfortunately, there's more and more comics that kind of look at the stage as kind of their platform, their soapbox, per se. I've never been that kind of comedian. I want my audience to be entertained first and foremost. And I think it kind of goes back to then what I was saying about a journalist. You want to make sure that they're engaged. And if that means asking them some, questions about themselves or their personal lives or anything that lets them talk about themselves, that's always been my approach.
Yeah, and I think that makes for good journalism because you want to reach that kind of human level. And I don't mean to make it too, weird, but it is true that you don't want to go up robotically and, what was the time? What was the date? What was the situation? You want to humanize it so that not only is it easier for the person you're interviewing, but I think it's more relatable and more interesting story to your listeners, right?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I think that's fascinating. How long were you doing the reporting?
I was a journalist for 5 years, and it was pretty much split equally, 2.5 as a print journalist, and then 2.5 as a broadcast journalist. And Scott, I was in a pretty good market in West Palm Beach. It was the top 50 market, which was a great place to start. I don't know what most people start in really small towns where it's like the 200th market. And I was fortunate to be, thrust into a fairly good sized news market quickly. But I knew that I was eventually going to have to move out of that. If I wanted to continue to be a TV journalist, I had to move. I had to move to a bigger market. And but the comedy bug was really taking hold at that point. And eventually I had to make a decision. Do I want to, because I knew if I had to move, I would be getting, nights and weekends, and I wouldn't be able to continue my comedy career just because I'd always be working. And eventually I had to make that decision, and comedy won out.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned the size of the markets because David Letterman started off as a weatherman in a really small market, but it gave him a foundation of his TV persona that, of course, took him to huge success. And I want to just take a second and explain to the audience that you're enjoying a beautiful day there in Tennessee. So we're hearing a little bit of the being outside, but good for you. We've all had a long, cold, wet winter, and we're recording this as we go into summer. But What's funny is when this launches and airs, it'll be back in winter. So, enjoy the sunshine,
Everybody's
right?
going to hate me. Everybody's going to hate me hearing boats go by. Yes, exactly. Just exactly what I was hoping for.
Right. So now you were making it kind of clear that you found some success. I mean, 2.5 years is short in life, but not short in a job. So you got some experience and had some success as a print writer and then as a TV reporter. But the comedy bug bit you during the mid 80s where comedy, what I call the rock and roll wave of comedy hit. Was that transition to full-time comic? I don't think it's ever easy, but how did it go for you?
It was scary, because I gave up a very good job that I loved and that I was good at. So, and I thrust myself into a pool that was saturated with comedians and starting at the bottom. So that I made sure that I had enough work before I went in and quit my job. I made sure that I had lined up probably 6 months of comedy club dates.
Oh, smart.
And they weren't in the most glamorous places, but I just couldn't, I think there are guys out there to this day that go up and have one good open mic set of 5 minutes and go in and quit their job the next day because they think they've got it. They think they figured this out and they're going to be a rock star. And it doesn't work that way, as we both know. So I wanted to make sure, and I also gave myself a timetable. I just said if I wanted to do it, maybe I said a year, which probably wouldn't have been enough time, maybe 2. But I didn't want to get too removed from journalism in case comedy didn't work out. I wanted to still be young enough to say, okay, it was almost like, okay, I took this little hiatus, which is a pretty cool hiatus. I'd say you went to become a comedian. That's a pretty cool hiatus to people, but I wanted to be sure that I could jump back into journalism if need be.
Right. And just to give a perspective, what age were you at this point?
I was 26 when I quit to be a full-time comedian.
So you were pretty young in your early television and writing career, because it sounds like when you came out of college, you hit the ground running and were able to get good jobs. And it's interesting that you enjoyed being a TV reporter. It was making you a living. And yet that excitement, the feeling we all get on stage in comedy was sufficient enough to draw you away from it. I think that's interesting. And
also, as I tell people, I was just, I enjoyed making people laugh more than depressing them. And I felt like as a journalist, I hate to say it, but it was still, most of the stories that I was doing was kind of gloom and doom stuff. I liked doing the lighter side of the news. Those were my favorite stories where I could interject a little humor. But I happened to live in an area where there was a huge crime problem, where there was lots of problems, period. And that's what they thrust me into. So, I reported on things and saw things that I wouldn't wish on anybody. And then to then flip around an hour later and be on a stage was weird. It was kind of almost a defense mechanism for me. But it was, and I didn't like the way news was going in general. I thought it was getting very sensationalistic, and I had to nothing like the way it is now. But I had to eventually say, is this the path I want to continue to go down? Seeing the way the news is being presented,
right?
And that's another thing that I think made the decision a little easier.
Well, I think that's so important. My bride is in law enforcement and has to deal with some really grisly things and trauma on a regular basis. But she was also my partner in the comedy clubs. We both have a good and kind of strange sense of humor. And I think that it's important that individuals, for their own sanity, find a balance and a way to escape the real life dramas of the world. And stand-up comedy or having a good sense of humor or just being aware of the brighter side is so important to everybody. I also wanted to touch on that. I think you made a good life choice that you were taking something that was a good job, you enjoyed doing it, but it was kind of a negative in your life, and going into comedy, which was a positive in your life. But also credit to you that you, even at 26, you were smart enough to look at it almost as a business professional and had a strategy. And so many of our peers are just like kind of having fun at stand-up, and they don't understand the business side. And I think
you're right.
You were able to differentiate the two and have a plan. So moving forward, now you're a stand-up comic, you're hitting the road, you're having some success. Jumping forward, I know that your career now is in public speaking. I mentioned that heavily in your intro, and that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today. How long were you doing just stand-up comedy? And then what was it that drew you to motivational speaking?
Yeah, it's great. I was a comic full time for probably, I would say, 4 years. But within those 4 years, I was an MC in a middle act. I couldn't quite crack headliner status, so I was making the same amount of money. But I hooked up with a company in Chicago, which is where I was living, that did live trade show presentations. They wrote them and then they presented them. And if you've ever been on a trade show floor, you've seen that certain booths, certain vendors hire like a speaker to pitch the product. They wear usually a headset microphone and they give the same presentation, 8, 9 times a day. And I hooked up with this company, started writing presentations. They liked my comedy background. In fact, a lot of Second City guys would do this as their side gig. Their daytime gig. And I would travel to trade shows all over the country, and some clients, and I had some big clients once I started as the presenter, because people liked my voice and that kind of thing. And I had stage presence, and I started to look at this trade show environment, and I started to write material about it. I write material about some of these companies and what they were pitching. And at the time, if you remember computers in the early 90s, that was the computer boom, the Windows 95 and that kind of thing. And I started writing material about what I was seeing and then putting that into my comedy club act. And just, how to run a computer, and do you see what's coming down the pike? And we're all using this cell phone, this weird cell phone now. And it was really resonating with club audiences. And then people were coming up to me afterwards and saying, hey, I work for Verizon, or I work for, Qualcomm, and some companies that don't exist anymore. And we're having an event. And if you could just come down and do 30 minutes and make sure you do that bit you did about being on hold with tech support, we'd love that. And, that's literally how it happened. And I started doing these. And then I got kind of noticed by some corporate agents. And I do remember, Scott, the very first big one that I did. I mean, I did like some golf outings and little stuff like that. But a corporate agent got wind of me, and he hired me to do a show for Hewlett-Packard at the Dolphin Hotel in Orlando. And I just had to do 20 minutes. And it was about for 500 people. And I'd researched them. I had, learned a little bit and wrote some jokes, not cruel jokes, not like, not real biting jokes, but just a little bit about what they were doing. And I almost had an epiphany moment on stage. I was just doing my show, and I thought to myself, this group, I thought, this is the nicest stage I've ever been on. This is the nicest hotel I've ever stayed in. And these people are so in need of humor, and they're laughing at themselves. They're loving it. Hence, going back to what we talked about in journalism, people open up if they can relate, if it's about them. Now, in this case, they weren't talking about themselves, but it's almost like I was saying stuff they wanted to say, but they couldn't, but it's kind of what they were thinking. And I just thought to myself, I go, this is where I belong. These venues and these audiences, this is what I want to be doing. And that was in 1994 or something, 1995, and that's what I've been doing since.
Well, you caught on early, and I've heard, I've interviewed a few other comics turned public speakers, and there's 2 points I wanted to make, and one is that what is obvious right from the beginning is the venues are nicer, there's more money to be made, and the audiences, even though they didn't sign up for a comedy entertainment event like somebody walking into a comedy club, it almost the humor almost catches them off guard and makes them a better audience, because you're, like you said, you're talking about what they know, you're relating to them, and we're here for a seminar, and all of a sudden a show breaks out. I mean,
that is exactly right. And that can kind of be a two-way street. I mean, you don't always, because I think sometimes people are so taken off guard that they haven't been prepped enough.
There's not a warm-up act or something.
Yeah, you go into a comedy club, you're there, you specifically went, as you touched on, to watch comedy. I have to almost win them over, and almost to the sense of, this is why I'm here, and this is why I'm being paid to do this for you. But I don't think it takes long, because, again, once they realize that you've done your homework, that you are talking about things and making light of things that they can relate to, meaning their job, the products that they're either manufacturing or selling or distributing, they really appreciate that. They really do. And it's a joy to watch when you know that you've hooked them.
Well, and I wanted to bring up two things. One is that the other advantage for a comic going into public speaking is that if you don't get as many laughs, but you're still connecting with them, well, that's really your job. You're not getting being rated by that laughs per minute scale that we do in comedy clubs. And I also wanted to reach back to how you started as what circus people would call the barker at trade shows, because much like stand-up comedy or being a television reporter, and I've been a barker at trade shows, so I know exactly what you're talking about. It's that unique ability, that type A personality, where you can stand in a room full of strangers and get their attention.
Yes.
Be able,
quickly.
You can get their attention, you can connect with them, and you get across a message or a sales pitch. Being a barker really ties in to everything and makes perfect sense as part of that progression to your almost 30-year success as a public speaker, because it's that ability in a unique situation, not necessarily perfect for stand-up comedy, but you're able to connect, relate, and entertain. And I think that that's really genius and smart of you to have been able to take that path. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah. And what's great about it is it continues to be something I think that people want. That will always continue. There will always be corporate events. Obviously, they've changed. COVID changed a lot of things, and I've had to adjust accordingly. But at the same time, I feel like there's always a place. There's always a place in the realm that I have chosen, the arena that I've chosen for humor in some capacity or another. And I think COVID, in a way, helped that.
Oh, interesting. I wouldn't have thought that, but I think it is poignant to say that being able to be a successful public speaker, where you're taking all these talents you've developed over the last 40 years from stand-up comedy, from being in journalism, to being able to entertain and get a message across. And I agree with you. I don't think that's going away, because corporations and companies need to humanize between management and the working bees. And that's what webinars, that's what these conventions, that's what these talks are all about. It's getting across a change in the company, or information about the company, or a sales push, or motivation. But it's all about getting everybody on the same page in the company. So what do you got planned for the future? Because I think that you've already proven to have a very long and successful career in public speaking. What's coming up for you?
Well, I think, as I said, I think that you have to change with the times, and your message has to change with the times. I think what is happening now, the big words that you're hearing in corporate America, which you weren't hearing even 3 or 4 years ago, wellness, employer retention, positive mental health, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is what every company is striving for. They want to keep, obviously, the best employees because people change jobs at the drop of a hat, as we both know. And every CEO, CMO, whatever, HR person wants to figure out, how do we retain the best employees? Well, you got to have a fun work environment. That's what the new generation of employees wants. They want work to be fun. Now, that's where comedy, I think, really plays in, and I can play off that. So what I'm trying to do, I created a new presentation during COVID, which I entitled, If Laughter is Healthy, Why Aren't We All Okay? And the whole idea was, and that title, I'm still toying with that title because it's gotten kind of mixed results, mixed reviews. But the whole idea is that you have to continue to keep laughter in the work environment. I think that even though a lot of companies say, oh, we're a fun group, we love to laugh, that's true on the surface. But I think they also are a little tentative to do it. I think they're a little tentative and a little afraid sometimes of humor. Well, and I think, you know why, right? I mean, I think that because we're all trying to make sure everybody feels safe and comfortable and those kind of words too. And I think what I'm trying to do is convince my audiences that the positive benefits of laughing and of humor far outweigh any negative, potentially negative ramifications, that you're going to do a lot more good for your company.
Right.
You allow people to laugh.
Right. You have, and I didn't want to get too deep into that because it's been brought up on other podcasts, but I imagine as a public speaker, this whole counterculture, everybody being, sensitive and it's not like you might offend them, because that's all it used to be, is you could pick on the guy with the ugly sweater or make fun of a college or something. Now people are trying to say that they're better than others because they can empathize with somebody else getting picked on. And it's just gotten way over the top. I've said this before.
And you're right. We don't need to dwell on it, but I do believe that there's a message there. But I also have, I'll pull back on that message if need be. I mean, what's great about having the track record that I do is that I've had clients say, just make us laugh. We had to lay off 20% of our workforce this year, and what's left of it just needs to laugh. And I'm happy to do a presentation like that too, because I've been through other times. I've been doing this long enough where that's not the first time that there's been something that's happened, whether it was a global economic meltdown, whether it was 9/11, whether it was COVID. I've worked through all of those things.
Yeah.
And yet people still keep coming back and saying, just make us laugh. So if that's what they want, that's fine. If they want like a tutorial a little bit about humor and why it's so important, spoken from the eyes of a comedian, then I can give them that too.
Well, I'm just so impressed with everything you've been able to put together, Greg. We have not worked together personally, but I can sense that you have gotten it. You understand the importance of that connection with an audience and then bringing that audience some joy. And whether it's stand-up comedy or a fluff piece as a TV reporter, and more recently, like 30 years, helping some staff, the employees of a company, see the brighter side of not only their lives, but also where they live and who they work for. And it is really a genius you've been able to do that. Are you thinking of doing any sort of book and sharing your knowledge, or master class, or you just going to
You know,
keep plugging ahead?
I've put my if laughter is healthy, why aren't we all okay? I have put that online with I've put that online, and it's gotten some okay reviews. But again, I just think that I think that what I do is just so much more effective live. I always remember one of my favorite. I remember listening to an interview with Jay Leno once, and he was just lamenting, like he said, why he never did a Netflix special. And he said, the idea of people watching him on their phone, and he cut himself off and he said, I just tell people, if you like me, I will come to you. I will come to your town, come see me live. And yes, I've done virtual shows, and I had to do them during COVID, and I think I did pretty well, and I will still do virtual shows if audiences if companies have limited budgets or they're still worried about everybody being together. That's fine, but I feed off the audience, and I feed off just knowing that, again, I just jumped into their event in the middle of a business conference, and I made them laugh, and it was something they weren't expecting, and maybe they learned something too. And that's what I hope to continue to do.
Well, that's a great message. And I think, whether you're working in front of the camera or at a trade show or on a comedy stage or as a presenter at an event, it's all about not only reaping something for yourself, getting that interaction with an audience, getting that positive feedback, and doing something that brings you joy, but you're able to share that back, that energy, that joy, that other view of things. Well, Greg, you've shared so much great stuff. If somebody wanted to reach out and hire you as a motivational speaker, how best to reach you?
Best way is obviously my website. That's gregschwem.com. I also am, as far as social media, for me, my probably most popular vehicle, the one I spend the most time on, is probably LinkedIn. Obviously, YouTube is as well, because people want to see what I do. But I find for what I do, LinkedIn, and you could just search my name on LinkedIn, and an awful lot of what I post on my other social media channels, I put up there too, because that's where business people hang out, and those are the people I want to reach.
Yeah, and I want to make it clear to my audience that it's Greg Schwem. It's a little bit unique of a last name, but SCHM. Excuse me, I did it wrong. SCHWEM, right?
Yeah, SCH Greg, SCHWEM as in mother.
There you go. So, ladies and gentlemen, be sure to check out Greg. He's on YouTube. He's got a great motivational talk. If you have a company that's looking for some shared information to feel better, to be more engaged in their company, reach out to him. He can help turn your employees into better employees, and that's a real gift. Greg, you've had a really successful and interesting life. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights with my audience.
My pleasure, Scott. And thank you for reaching out to me again. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay tuned next week. Another great show. And don't forget, check out Greg Schwem on LinkedIn, and let's all make it a better world. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stand-Up Comedy, your host and MC. For information on the show, merchandise, and our sponsors, or to send comments to Scott, visit our website at www.standupyourhostandmc.com. Look for more episodes soon and enjoy the world of stand-up comedy. Visit a comedy showroom near you.